So, welcome to all of you, and thanks for coming and braving the weather. So, our theme for tonight is art and beauty and their relationship with their faith. And so, the mission of art and beauty in human life. And this is one of the last week and next week we'll talk about what it means for man to be made in the image of God. And this openness to art and beauty is one of the essential features of man being in the image of God, who is beauty. And so it's a property of the human person, and of any person, to be open to beauty. And so I thought I'd start by sharing with you how I came to understand the mission of art and beauty through my personal experience. When I was in high school, I wanted to be an artist, and I was formed in modern art, in the ideology of modern art. And it is an ideology. In other words, there's a whole set of things that one must do and one can't do. We were taught that art, we were given a definition of art. It's what the artist does. Right? Now, that's if you think about that, that's a cop-out, right? That's a non-definition. Art is what the artist does, and there's a reason for that. It's so that you could say absolutely anything goes, right? That art is whatever we want to call it. And we don't want to accept that definition of art. So one of the things we want to look at is, what is art in reality? And the idea of that definition, art is what an artist does, is that it goes together with another phrase, art for art's sake. In other words, that the artist has no other end than simply making art. Right? And so that leads to the question, well, what is art for? And one of the things that in the classical tradition art is for is to give glory to God by imitating His creation. Now, in the ideology of modern art, that's out. You can't do that. That's, in fact, the worst thing that you can set out to do is to imitate nature. And that'll be called slavish or servile. Because the artist has to be totally creative. Now, obviously the artist does have to be creative, but not totally creative. Right? Because God is the only one who is totally creative. And another thing that we were taught we couldn't do was to imitate the old masters, to imitate tradition. Right? Because that also was out. We had to follow the spirit of the age, or to be a couple steps ahead of it. Right? And so the goal of the artist in modern times is to be avant-garde. Avant-garde means in the forefront. It's in an army, the group that's way out in front, exploring the territory. But nobody, as far as I can remember, ever talked about beauty and what beauty is when I was studying art, which is kind of odd because that's what art should be all about. Now, one of the key events in my life was studying art history here in St. Louis at Washington University. Went to Washington University, that's where I met Marcia. And in my first semester there, I took an obligatory course, required course, on art and civilization, which ended up changing my life, although not immediately. And it was a great professor, Norris K. Smith. Nobody's ever heard of him except other people who went to WashU at that time. And what he would do is he would show us two pictures side by side and contrast them. And so in the first class, he showed these two pictures, or something like them. Woman number 4 by an abstract expressionist painter, de Kooning, and a Rembrandt portrait. And he asked us, if you were on your deathbed, which of these two images would you want to contemplate before you died? This is a room full of 218-year-olds, freshmen in college, and it got our attention. It's the only first class of any class that I can remember, or in fact, just about the only class that I can remember from my college years. And his thesis was that art isn't just about I like it or I don't like it. Because if you like it, you don't like it, and that doesn't have anything to do with your deathbed. But art has to do with something much more important than simply something that is sensibly appealing by nice colors or nice shapes or a play of colors and shapes. And so his whole thesis was that art is about actually a whole vision of the world and about truth, about man, God, and the world and how they're related. And the different works of art express silently different convictions about those things: who is man, who is God, and the world. And so appreciating a work of art isn't simply liking it. Appreciating a work of art is understanding also the vision of the world that's in the work, right? That's being manifested by the work, and judging whether that vision is true or false, whether it promotes human dignity or tramples on it. Right? And so I think all of us in that room could see, even though I was making things like woman number 4, but we could all see that tramples human dignity, whereas the Rembrandt does the opposite. And so the point was that art is about truth and can't be understood apart from the question of truth. And that's because beauty and truth go together. Beauty, truth, and goodness. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Right? And so bad art is not just art that's done by an amateur or somebody who hasn't studied. But bad art is also bad because it expresses a false view of man and the world and God. So that was one of the things I got from this course. Another thing I got from this course is that he hated Hegel. Hegel, German philosopher, had the idea that art has to express the spirit of the times. And there's a German word, that Zeitgeist, just means spirit of the times. And basically for Hegel, a work of art is good if it expresses the spirit of the times. And in fact, if it's a little bit ahead of it. And it's bad if it's retrograde, if it's expressing the spirit of past times. Right? It'll be irrelevant or reactionary, which is just about the worst thing you can say about a work of art. And my professor hated that, because that implied that somehow the artist's role is simply to express the times, whether they're good or bad. Whereas in reality, the artist has a better role, a greater role, just as the prophet does. No, the prophet of Israel wasn't merely to express the times, but he was to judge the times and to propose God's vision for the times. Right? That's the role of a prophet. Well, an artist is called to that prophetic role also. Right? That's one of the great missions of art. And so it's very often to resist the spirit of the times, or to counter the spirit of the times, to do the opposite of the spirit of the times. Okay, so that course got me thinking, and it took years. And so in art, I started to go back studying the masters. We ended up going to Italy and copying, studying from Michelangelo and Donatello and the others. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Rediscovering the tradition. And let's start, though, by speaking a little bit about beauty. What is beauty? And then we'll look at tradition. Now, this is going to be a little abstract. Beauty is broader than art. No, there's beauty in nature. There's beauty in all of God's works. And art imitates that beauty that is in God's works. Right? And so art also tries to express beauty precisely by imitating God's order. So we can say that the fine arts, their goal is to express beauty in the things that man makes. But what is beauty? Now, in our culture, we learn that beauty is subjective. Right? There's that phrase that everybody knows: beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And there's some truth in that, but there's also a great falsehood. Right? That beauty isn't simply subjective. So what is beauty? The classical definition is beauty is what's pleasing to sight. And the definition that St. Thomas Aquinas gives. And sight, here doesn't mean just the eyes, but sight would be also the mind and the ears. In other words, whatever our cognitive powers. And so beauty is what pleases the eye and the mind. And why does it please? Because of order and proportion. And we could say that because the things that God makes have order and proportion, they're beautiful. And so it's something objective. And so likewise in art, when there's order and proportion and harmony, there will be beauty, and not just in the eye of the beholder, but in the work. And when those things are lacking, there'll be ugliness and disharmony, right? And in reality. Now, for the philosopher, everything that is has some beauty. And the philosophers call this transcendental properties of being. Transcendental, what do we mean by that? Simply that it transcends any particular class of things. In other words, beauty isn't limited to, physical being, because there's also beauty in spiritual being. Beauty isn't limited to, it's not limited to bodies, it's not limited to spirits, it's not limited to color, it's not limited to sound. We find it everywhere where there's being. We go to the zoo and we find beauty, but we find grades of beauty. Some animals more beautiful than others, and it goes together with things being higher than others. Where we find more being, there's more beauty. But where there's a lack of the being that ought to be there, like just even on a physical level, somebody loses a limb. Right? There's a loss of beauty because there's a loss of the being that ought to be there. And it's even more true in the moral sphere. If sin, if we could see it rightly, sin is ugly because it's the lack of order that ought to be in our actions. Right? There's nothing uglier than sin. And so where there's being, there's beauty, and where there's a lack of being, there's a lack of beauty. And it goes together with goodness. Where there's being, there's goodness. Where there's a lack of being, there's a lack of goodness. And the same thing goes for truth. Where there's being, there's a truth about that being. But where there's the lack, sin, for example, is false. Right? Because it's not what the action ought to be. There's something false about it. And just as there's something ugly, and obviously something evil. And so we find that ugliness, evil, and falsehood go together, whereas beauty, truth, and goodness go together. And in fact, there's a fourth, unity. Wherever we find being, we find unity, goodness, truth, and beauty. More being, more of those. Less being, especially less being that ought to be there, then we get the opposite, disunity, ugliness, evil, and falsehood. Another one we could add is individuality. More being, more individuality. And we find that in persons. So the saints who have the most being, we could say, are the most individual, right? They're unforgettable. Whereas evil tends to be repetitive and unindividual. Mediocrity. Anyway, so goodness, truth, beauty, unity, and individuality. They go together. Okay, and what's the difference? Well, beauty, truth, is being in relation to our intellect. Right? So truth is the conformity of our intellect with reality. Goodness is the conformity of reality with an upright will. In other words, goodness is, for lack of, we can't define these things because they're too fundamental, but we can say goodness is what all desire, in the sense that goodness is what the will seeks. Right? The will, by its very nature, seeks the good. And what about beauty? It's harder. And so it seems that beauty involves both the intellect and the will. What's beautiful is what's good for our eyes and our mind. In other words, what's beautiful is what pleases our sight, physical sight, but even more our mental sight. Right? So it's as if it's combining both appealing both to our intellect and will. Okay, let's look at the characteristics of beauty. St. Thomas gives 3. Okay. Yeah. Back one? Okay, no, just go for it. St. Thomas says that there are 3 fundamental aspects of beauty. Maybe with integrity, in other words, it's a whole. Proportion, and clarity or splendor of form. And so things are pleasing to the eyes when they're a whole, when they're rightly proportioned, and when they have a certain splendor or clarity. And St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't speak much about beauty, but what he does say is really interesting. He compares, in one section of his Summa of Theology, he speaks about the 3 persons of the Trinity and how we associate certain things with one or other of the 3 persons. And he says beauty gets associated with the second person of the Trinity, the Son. That's interesting. Why? Because the Son is the perfect image of the Father. And that's how Scripture, for example, St. Paul in Colossians 1:15 speaks of Christ as the image of the invisible God, the image of the Father. And He's the Word of the Father. Right? A perfect Word. The Word that says everything about the Father. And so, the Word, or the image, are aspects, there's a likeness to art. Right? Because a work of art is an image. And a work of literature is a work of the Word. And all art involves likeness. Right? And so the Son is the perfect likeness. The perfect likeness of the Father. So like that He's one God with the Father. And so the Son is, beauty is like the Son of God because it has integrity. The Son is all that He's an integral image of the Father. Nothing's lacking. He's got perfect proportion and a clarity. And that clarity also we see in the Incarnation, that Christ becomes man to show us what it is to be man and to show us the way back to the Father. And so there's a clarity. And we can add one more quality maybe to beauty, that all beauty involves unity in variety. And how do we grasp beauty? We can't really go into that here, but earlier in the course we talked about the internal senses, that there's an internal sense, what I call the associative sense, a sense by which we associate particular things and grasp the particular values of things even before we deliberate. And it seems that that's how we recognize beauty. In that way, prior to deliberation, we grasp a concrete thing as having a value, this value of harmony, proportion, and clarity. And so, beauty helps us to form our internal senses, and it helps us also to. It acts like a tutor, leading us to higher things. Just in my own life, we came to the faith partly through the arts. In other words, we could see in art truths of faith before we could grasp them intellectually. And so art was leading us like a kind of tutor. And that's an old idea. Plato, in his Republic, he speaks of the arts as having this function, And therefore, you can't allow just any work of art into the well-ordered republic. But many works of art will have to be, for Plato, banished. Now, of course, that's politically incorrect in our culture, but Plato's idea was that many kinds of music he thought were unsuitable to a good republic, because instead of leading one to serenity and balance, they excited the emotions too much, exciting the passions, and so he banished those from his republic. We'll come back to that. Okay, so we said that beauty, because it has to do, wherever there's being, there's beauty. More being, more beauty. Well, being is objective. It follows that beauty is something objective. Right? Just as proportion, harmony, clarity, integrity, these are objective things. Beauty likewise will be objective. So why do we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder? Well, there may be that beauty out there in the work or in nature, in a person, but it could be that I can't see it because my eye isn't formed. And so the truth about beauty is in the eye of the beholder is the necessity of formation in order to appreciate beauty. In other words, everything is received. This is a fundamental principle of philosophy and theology. Everything is received according to the mode of the receiver. So I'll receive things according to my mode of being. If my mode of being is unformed, I won't be able to receive the beauty that's out there. So if I've been formed on, like back in our first example, woman number 6, I might have difficulty appreciating the beauty of, say, the Rembrandt. Or maybe an easy example is, if I've never heard Bach before, the first time I hear, a Bach fugue, it might sound like sewing machine music. God forbid. But, and so to appreciate beauty requires a trained eye or ear or mind. Right? And that's why we say it's in the eye of the beholder. But it's really objective. Okay. And one of the most beautiful things about art and beauty is that since where there's being, there's beauty, more being, more beauty, God is beauty with a capital B. He's the beauty. And so beauty in art and nature, just like truth and goodness and unity, they lead us to God. Because we can see grades of beauty. Right? There's the beauty, and this is, again, an ancient idea that Plato recognized. A beautiful passage of Plato's Symposium speaks about, it's a dialogue about beauty and love. And in the course of it, after various people give speeches about what is beauty, and at the end, even Socrates is eclipsed, and Plato brings in someone else, a priestess, who speaks about the grades of beauty. The beauty, say, of nature. The beauty of of a body. The beauty of a work of art, architecture, the beauty of a moral action, say self-sacrifice, for giving one's life for one's country, or the beauty of a spiritual action, right? The martyr giving his life for the faith, the beauty of charity. And so there are grades, and so this character says, well, what would it be like to see not just a beauty with a small b, but to see beauty with a capital B? Well, that would be something worth contemplating forever. Right? That's, in fact, man's end. That's the beatific vision, to contemplate the beauty of God forever. Right? And so art and beauty can serve to lead us to God. And of course, they can serve to lead us away from Him if it's bad art, which will be ultimately ugly. Right, so beauty is the first element of art. Let's look at, there are fundamentally, I think, 4 elements of the work of art. Yeah. Beauty, to manifest beauty, to imitate the order of nature. But every work of art also lives in a tradition out of which it grows, and apart from which it can't be rightly understood. So anyone who studies the history of art has to study the traditions in which works of art are situated. And finally, every work of art has in it and manifests a vision of the world, a worldview, a vision of truth about what's ultimately important in life. So let's go through this. Let's start with the second one, the imitation of nature. And this again is a classical idea. Plato and Aristotle define art as imitation. An imitation, not a slavish imitation, but an imitation of the order that God puts in His creation. Right? So it's the artist imitating God. And so that means that art, all art, is fundamentally realist in some sense. But at the same time, it's also symbolic because it's representing, it's imitating a truth that goes beyond the mere object that you're painting. And so every work of art will be at one and the same time realist and symbolic. Right? And some works will emphasize the one or the other. Right? So the key thing is that the imitation isn't merely slavish. So the great artist his goal isn't simply to take, some object out there and to copy it as it is, like a photograph. That's what people, when I was doing sculpture, everyone would, to compliment you, right? They'd come over and say, it's fantastic, it looks like a photograph. And the fact is that you can't take a photograph of a person and have it look like any of these statues. I mean, it won't look like them. And so art doesn't seek merely to imitate what's there. It seeks to imitate what ought to be there. In other words, art seeks to imitate the essence of things. Some kind of essence. And it could be the essence of man, or it could be the essence of a particular... So, for example, Michelangelo is trying to depict the essence of David's action. In other words, it's the essence of zeal for God, courage, daring, audacity, resolve, determination. In other words, he's trying to express the essence of David just before he goes out to fight Goliath. And thus he's trying to express a universal about that. And that's what makes it so great, is that he succeeds. And likewise, the work there by Polyclitus is trying to express, in some sense, the essence of man as a microcosm. And the idea was this, that for the Greeks, human nature, in some way, is a mirror of all of creation. And we talked about that a little bit at the beginning when we said that man sums up in himself the two parts of God's creation, the material and the spiritual. And so every man in that sense is a kind of cosmos in miniature. That's what microcosm means. A little universe. And the Greek idea was that being a little universe also meant that you had to have in you the harmonies of the whole universe. In other words, that in each man there's a series of harmonies that for the Greeks was also numerical. In other words, the Greek artists measured the proportions of the human body and idealized them, and those works express what they call a canon of proportions. Now, when you look at it, you generally don't ever think that it involves number, but it's the same with music. Any piece of music is harmonious because the different notes are in a mathematical proportion to one another. Right? An octave is a relation of 2 to 1 of the waves of the music. And the same thing happens in the visual arts, that something is pleasing because it's numerical, it has numerical proportion in it. And so he puts that in there because there's a conviction also behind it that man, by being a microcosm, reflects the order of the universe and thus is an ordered creation, a supremely ordered creation. Right? So he's not just simply slavishly imitating. And it's very different from much of modern art, which is super realism. So, for example, there's a work by Chuck Close on the screen, Big Self-Portrait. And what the artist has done, he's a famous contemporary artist, very famous, and he's taken a photograph of himself smoking and blown it up and meticulously painted it on a giant canvas. And the impression that it gives is, I think, intended to be the banality of life. Whereas Rembrandt here, in his self-portrait, is showing, in some way, just the opposite, the depths of the human person. And so, what ends up happening with superrealism is that you copy the outside, and what happens in a great work of realist art is that you try and copy the inside. But by using the outside, in other words, the two go together. You want to do both. You represent the inside through the outside. But that means you have to modify a little bit the outside. Right? You can't just take a photograph of a scene that will look like the Rembrandt self-portrait. Here, one of these is a classical work, and the other is a modern post-superrealist work. The Durer paints weeds, trying to show the intelligibility of those weeds. Lucian Freud paints weeds to show the chaos of the weeds. And so it's just the chaos. There's no, and intentional, I think. Or another example, Durer's rabbit. I love this. Durer, he's not just, it's meticulously detailed. Right? But the whole point is to give you the essence of a rabbit so that you could think that it could run or jump. Now Aristotle has a work on aesthetics called the Poetics, and he makes a very profound remark. He says that art and he's speaking about drama above all, that the purpose of drama is not simply to say what happens, but to say what should happen. In other words, to give the essence of a particular scene. And so he asks this question, is poetry more like philosophy or more like history? Right? Because history, a good historian has to say what happened. Whereas the artist, Aristotle says, is more like the philosopher because his goal is to say what kind of thing ought to happen. In other words, to get at the essence of it. And so he says, the poet's function is to describe not the thing that has happened, that's the historian, but a kind of thing that might or should happen. Right? So it's not that the historian writes in prose and the poet writes in verse, but it's that the one, the historian, describes the thing that has been, and the other, the poet, the kind of thing that might be or should be. So poetry, he says, is more philosophic than history. And it's about universals, even though it's all, an artist has to make something particular, but the purpose of that particular is to reveal a universal. And that has to do with what St. Thomas called the splendor of the form, or the clarity. Right? So the artist's goal is to show this some universal, but in particular form. Now somebody might protest and say, well, what about forms like architecture and music? Do they also imitate? And so the answer here is yes. Great works of architecture, and even bad ones, imitate nature, but in different ways. I think the easiest example to see this is the Greek temple. In a Greek temple, the columns, a Greek column can't simply be made any way you like. Just like those figures that we looked at, the statues of classical Greek art, were governed by a strict canon of proportions. The columns are likewise governed by very strict canons of proportions that is on the model of the human figure. Right? So you can't just elongate a column as long as you like in Greek architecture, or make it as stumpy as you like. If you want to make a bigger temple, you have to expand everything proportionately, so that no matter how big or small the temple, the column always represents the human figure. Right? And why is that? Well, my professor at Washington University, his thesis, you can't demonstrate this, but his thesis was that the columns represent the citizens in the Republic, in some sense. Because one of the beauties of a Greek temple is that the columns are like, they're persons, no, they're human figures, and they're supporting the roof. They're supporting the entablature, just as the citizens in any society ought to be supporting the common good. And we see that this is not just an art historian's idea, that the column represents the human figure, because there are some Greek temples in which they actually put human figures there. And this is in the Parthenon, the Acropolis in Athens, next to the Parthenon. They put these female figures. And there are different orders of Greek columns. They have different names. There's Doric columns and Ionic columns and Corinthian columns. And they actually represent the two sexes, the two genders. So the Doric, go back one. The Parthenon uses Doric columns, and the Doric columns are more masculine. They express a kind of robustness, whereas the Ionic columns are more slender, and the same thing would be true of the column that's being represented there, are more slender and elegant, and thus representing a kind of female vision. And one of the beauties of the fact that the column represents the human figure is that you make a very big temple, and it doesn't dwarf the human person, but quite the contrary, it enlarges us, because we see the columns as a human figure, and so the larger temple simply elevates the human figure instead of crushing it, like, say, a skyscraper does, or like those gigantic, massive buildings of the Soviet bloc that just crush and dehumanize the person. Okay, and the same thing goes for music. Music also is about imitation, and it's most obvious in lyrics. Now, in music that's setting forth words, but it's the same when there are no words. That every work of music represents the emotions, the inner life. And we naturally experience that. Different works of music or different styles of music have different effects on our emotions because they're imitating those emotions. Right? And the very fact that we can put words to music shows that that representational quality of music. Okay, let's look at the third element of art is tradition. And so every work of art is situated in a tradition simply because it's a work of human culture. And that's because of human limitation. No one person can invent something from scratch. Right? We build on the shoulders of those who come before. And that's what makes human culture great, is when there's a building over many generations. And we see this in the different periods of classical art, and especially the great periods, how one builds on another. So, for example, in classical music, you get Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, each one building on the predecessor and carrying it further. And in classical Greek art, there's a beautiful development of the male, the human statue, the representation of the human figure. So I've given you here works separated by about 500 years. So in the 7th century BC, on the left there, it's stiff and basically in the form of Egyptian art. 50 years pass, and it's the same basic posture, but what's happened? There are curves where before there were just straight lines. Another 50 years, and there are far more curves, and we feel it succeeds far more at conveying the essence of man. And then 50 years later, a slight adjustment, the artist shifts the hips and puts the weight on one leg, and the other leg is at ease. And art historians have a name for that, contrapposto. And the result is a naturalness that somehow is far more human. A kind of balance. There's a balance of forces that represents the ideal of balance of the human person. Right? But the changes are slight. No? Each one modifying a little bit. No? And so that's the idea of a tradition. We could do the same thing with, say, Romanesque architecture or Gothic architecture. How each cathedral took the previous cathedral a little further and made it taller and more vertical and more stained glass windows and more transcendent. Until finally one of them was too high and collapsed. And so that was kind of the end of the course. Okay, let's look at the fourth aspect. Every work of art, we said, represents a vision of faith, of how the world is, a conviction about what is of value, right? Whether intentionally or not. And art is great when it puts itself in service of true conviction about the world, when it puts itself in the service of the true faith. Well, it represents ideals that are great. So let's take some examples. Right, this is more about the development of a tradition. I should have. Right, so it ends up here with the. Anyway. So, for example, Jan van Eyck, the Arnolfini wedding. And so the artist here is putting his art in the service of what is marriage. There's a vision of marriage as sacrament. And everything in the painting is in service of that vision of marriage. And so you have the two figures equally balanced, right? So the fundamental equality of spousal love. And even simple details like the slippers here. Why are his slippers in front of him? It recalls the words of God to Moses, right? Take off your sandals. This is holy ground. Right? And so marriage being a sacrament is sacred. And so the husband takes off his shoes to represent the sacredness of the wedding. The dog in the center. Dog is a symbol of fidelity. Right? And so it's the fidelity of marriage. The woman is lifting up her skirt to make her look as if she's pregnant. Right? She's not. She's just getting married. But it's to show the fruitfulness, which is the end of marriage. In the center, so there's the chandelier of a light from above, the truth that illuminates marriage, and in the center there's a mirror, but around the mirror there's actually the stations of the cross, if you look very closely. And that also has a meaning. No, that's the trials that one must go through in every vocation, and in a particular and also the sacrament of marriage, of matrimony. And then in the center of that mirror, Van Eyck has depicted himself as one of the two witnesses of the wedding, together with, I suppose, the priest. In any case, we go on the light coming in, and here the canopy of the wedding bed. And so everything in the painting has a meaning about the sacredness of marriage. Let's take another example. Art very often can be put in celebrating, say, martyrdom. So the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, St. Sebastian. It could be the celebrating even a secular thing, like the founding of our nation. So Washington and his men crossing the Delaware. That's a magnificent depiction of a founding event of our country. Different visions of death in art. So I'm going to contrast two paintings about death. So this is El Greco, Spanish artist of the 17th century, the great age of faith in Spain. And he's depicted the burial of Count Orgaz. Count Orgaz was a layman with the fame of sanctity. And at his death, there appeared in the funeral two saints to participate in the burial, St. Stephen and St. Augustine, who were his patron saints, I think. That would be pretty good, not to have the two saints come down and inter you. And so El Greco has painted the scene, and his format is vertical. No, the painting is vertical, so as to show above all, the heavenly drama of what happens when someone dies. And when someone dies, it doesn't just take place on earth, but it's above all a heavenly event. And so we see our Lord with Our Lady and John the Baptist and all the saints to receive his soul as it's brought up. Let's contrast that with a 19th century work by Courbet, another burial at Ornans. And Courbet was an atheist and a communist, a kind of radical agitator as well as a great painter. And his vision of death is the opposite, of El Greco. And so here it's the burial of some nameless person, and in the center there's this hole in the ground. Right? There's this black hole. And his idea is that's the end of life, is just this black hole. And the dog is looking away, and people are all distracted. And it's true, Christ, the crucifix is there, but he's truncated. Right? So he's exaggerated the horizontal aspect simply by making it very wide and taking away the vertical dimension. Right? And that's a symbol of his conviction that there is no vertical dimension to death. And so we wouldn't have to put a work like this on a wall. Right? Next one. Picasso is a very interesting example. In Picasso's youth, he did this painting at 13 or something like that, early teenager, and it's a magnificent painting, Science and Faith. And I have to look this up, but I seem to remember it being his mother's deathbed, but I'd have to check that. And he's got two figures: the doctor taking the pulse, and the nun offering charity, offering in this case tea, holding an infant, I guess her child. And so it's science and we could say reason and faith, reason and charity, science and faith. And so he's actually depicted in a magnificent way two poles of human life in harmony. But the tragedy of Picasso's life is that harmony is almost immediately lost and never returns, and simply he reflects the loss of that harmony. Just one example out of tens of thousands, in which Picasso so vividly represents the loss of that balance. Okay. So let's talk more about what it means for there to be Christian art. And then we'll talk about modern art as a rejection of those principles of Christian art. Now we speak of, those who study philosophy, we speak of a Christian philosophy. A Christian philosophy would be a philosophy which is influenced by the faith. Right? So the philosopher, when he does Christian philosophy, he's doing philosophy, just like a pagan philosopher, but his philosophy will be deeply colored by what he believes through faith and what he loves. Right? And the same thing goes for Christian art. A Christian work of art ought to be imbued with the faith. In other words, with a particular vision of the world that we get from Revelation. We could say that there are four principal goals of Christian art. To give glory to God, to serve the liturgy, right? And so much of Christian art, say the Gothic cathedrals, Gregorian chant, Palestrina, so much of Christian art was meant directly to serve God in the liturgy. And also to represent revelation. So much, almost all of Renaissance art, that's an exaggeration, but 90%, I would say, of medieval and Renaissance art depicts themes from the Bible or from the lives of the saints. And that's a magnificent way of catechizing. Very often people say that people in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages were totally unfamiliar with the Bible. Well, it's true, they were illiterate, but they knew the Bible so much better than we do. So much better, because everywhere you went, the Bible was represented, in visual form. And then finally, one of the purposes of Christian art is to represent the Christian vision of the world, even when one is doing a secular theme. And so, even say in a portrait, a Christian portrait, like say these Rembrandt or Velázquez, it represents the Christian view of the human person, having an immortal soul made for God, made for entering into the communion of the divine life. That's Rembrandt, a self-portrait. He's just gone bankrupt in that portrait. He's lost everything. But he depicts himself, in some sense, as kingly in his person. And Velázquez, it's a portrait of his servant, who, of a lower social class, Moorish features, but he's depicted him, again, with that dignity. Let's look at church architecture. Church architecture has, precisely because it's to house the sacred liturgy and the sacrifice of the Mass. In other words, to make a place in architecture in which the most sacred event of all time will take place. Because every Mass makes present the sacrifice of Calvary, by which the world was redeemed, and makes present on the altar Jesus Christ as the divine victim. And so architecture that's put, church architecture, you can't just do anything. In other words, an architect who's hired to make a church can't simply be indulging his aesthetic interest. Right? But he has to do certain things. Right? And so the first function would be to represent the verticality. In other words, that reaching up for God and God coming down to earth. Right? The church architecture ought to represent visually the touching of earth and heaven. Right? And that's done above all by the vertical dimension, the vault. Or it could be done by a dome, like the dome of St. Peter's, or even the dome of the Basilica here next door. And it could be the bell tower, like the towers of, say, a Gothic cathedral, Cologne Cathedral, that point to heaven. And then it has to be ordered, no? Because a church, it's representing the Logos. God the Son is the Word, is the order from which the world was made. No, God is the source of all order. And so a church building ought to be especially orderly. In other words, have special harmony, symmetry, and proportion. And when it doesn't have that, next one. All right, even a pagan temple. No, so even the Parthenon, even though they didn't know the true religion and they're worshiping idols, they still understood that the temple had to represent the order of God. Right? It's magnificent. Like the symmetry, say, of the vault. Right? Representing, as it were, the harmony of the heavens. Modern art, very often, in church architecture, seeks to destroy that harmony. And so this is a church in Vienna, of all places, where there are so many beautiful churches, Church of the Holy Trinity, in which there's no access, and that's very purposeful. And so what's really being done here is that the architect is putting forth an anti-Christian view, an anti-theistic view. It's really a kind of atheist view that's lying behind that. Right? And so we ought not to have our churches look like that. Right? And so church architecture ought to portray eternity, right? Because the church is the portal of eternity. And it can do that in different ways. And it does that in one way, also in addition to eternity, to representing the body of Christ. Right? In other words, a church has to represent universality. It has to have an embrace that's universal. And it has to have reverence for what takes place, the sacrifice of the Mass. Right? And so, say in the cathedral here, the Baldacchino, just like in St. Peter's. And then the prominence given to the Blessed Sacrament. Right? You can't just. So obviously, the Blessed Sacrament is meant to go at the center. Right? It should, insofar as it's possible, to represent visually that Christ is the center of the world and history. Okay. Right, and representing eternity, and I think the most magnificent representation of eternity are the stained glass of the Gothic cathedrals. Okay, now the same goes for music. Sacred music that we use in the liturgy, you can't just use any music. There's a very important document, it's 100 years old, but it's not untimely, by St. Pius X on sacred music. And he speaks of three principal things that that sacred music ought to have. It ought to be holy in the sense of inspiring prayer. It ought to be beautiful and harmonious, and it ought to be universal in the sense of not being merely a current fashion, but something that would be appealing everywhere and always. And so that's what we ought to have in our sacred music. And above all, it should have a kind of timelessness, right? So that it can represent the divine. So you don't want to have, say, a drum beat in sacred music, to say the least. Because it wants to, the whole purpose is to take you out of the beat of this world, and to bring you into God's time. Okay, let's look at modern art, just briefly, and where we see the opposite of so many of the things we've been talking about. And so much of modern art has a new ideal. That wasn't one of those four that we put down. We said that art was about beauty, imitation, a tradition, and a vision of the world. Now, modern art puts forth a different ideal, self-expression. And so if you ask any modern artist, what are you doing? I'm expressing myself. No, we all say that. And that's not a good answer. We do it without thinking. But our purpose shouldn't be to express ourselves, because who am I ultimately? What I want to be expressing is something bigger than me. Right? And so one of the tragedies of modern art is that we could say that the center of gravity, the emphasis, has come to be me, rather than, say, God or truth, or even beauty. And so the idea of self-expression. And that came about in the 19th century Romanticism. That's the beginning of self-expressionism. And you see it more in the 20th century, and now the 21st. Now, obviously there is going to always be self-expression. And that's simply because you can't help but express some aspect of who you are as you do something. In other words, who you are will come out whether you like it or not. But it ought not to be our goal simply to express myself, right? Because that would be narcissistic. If you were to ask Michelangelo, what are you doing in making the David? Could you imagine him saying, I'm expressing myself? Right? He would fall over. He's trying to express the David. Right? Or in making St. Peter's, the dome, Michelangelo was the architect for the Dome of St. Peter's. What was he doing? He wasn't expressing himself. He was trying to express the glory of God. The divine, he's trying to express heaven, in some sense, on earth. Or take the Last Judgment. Is Michelangelo expressing himself? Right? He's trying to express reality, the ultimate reality. I remember going to St. Peter's before our conversion, and we went there, and it was packed as always, thousands of people there, everybody oohing and ahhing, and so it struck me, my goodness, everybody's here admiring this, and nobody's asking, is there a judgment? Is it true? And I wasn't asking that either, but I asked it. And so that was kind of an approach. Right? So Michelangelo's not trying to express his personality, but the ultimate truth about human life. Right? And the ultimate truth is good and objective, good and evil, and judgment. Okay, so what were the stages of the development of modern art? I'm going to take as the first stage Impressionism. Now, everybody loves Impressionism for the most part, and I do too. But there's something that one ought to notice in Impressionist works of art. The sacred drops out, and the artist tends to put all the emphasis on simply modern life. Modern life as if it were, in some sense, well, it's the glorification of modern life. But behind that glorification of modern life, there's an emptiness. And so it's very often scenes at the cafe, scenes of the streets and the movement and travel and transportation, the trains and the smoke, technology, the bar, but ultimately, what's left at the end of the day? And so some of the greatest paintings of Impressionism are precisely showing the lack. And, well, that's a good thing, but they don't have anything positive to offer. And so moving Degas, the absinthe drinker, right? That's kind of an addictive, or here the bartender at the Folie Bergère, a famous nightclub. Now obviously, art doesn't always have to treat religious subjects, but when it completely drops out, that's a problem. No, art is participating in the secularization of society. And the next step was that not only the sacred drops out, but the human tended to drop out in the beginning of the 20th century. And so you get things like Mondrian, very famous. You see his works everywhere, especially in corporate culture, or in hotel rooms even. They're impersonal, no? And it fits a corporate, unfortunately. Right? That's the problem. And so art gets conceived as a play. Now, I'm not saying that art isn't partly about a play of forms. It is, but it's more than simply a play with forms. Right? And so there's a statement being made here that's reductive. And so it became fashionable to reject the imitation, and by rejecting imitation, they rejected even the representation of depth. One of the great conquests of Renaissance art was perspective, the technique by which you could portray space in a painting. Right? The painting's flat, but the great Renaissance painting makes it look like it goes way back. I think of Leonardo. He paints these mountains in the distance, it looks like they're miles back. Whereas in the 20th century art, the idea was to make it look flat. Well, that's a lot easier because it's already flat. The height of this, I can't show it to you here, was, in the middle of the 20th century, a series of works, white on white and black on black. And you can just imagine the white screen. That would be your white on white. And these got into famous museums. The Museum of Modern Art in New York. And they're among the most famous artists of the 20th century. Rauschenberg does white on white. And there was even, in music, a comparable thing. John Cage did a famous piece of music, 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. And what happens is the performer, dressed in his tuxedo, comes up to the piano, opens up the piano elaborately, sits down, puts his watch on the keyboard, and watches it for whatever, 2 minutes, whatever, and then he gets up. That's the first movement. Bows, goes back, and then he comes out for the second movement, same thing. It's different time though. And then there's a third movement, all silent. And so altogether 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Now the first time that this was performed, people were they felt cheated. They were paying good money to come to this concert. But the second time it was performed, he got a standing ovation. Right? That's the Emperor's New Clothes. Right? And so John Cage said of this that this is his favorite work of music. And it's his favorite because of the variety. You get a different experience each time. It might be raining. It might be the wind, the coughs of the audience, allergy season, I don't know. Sorry. Before that, there was atonal music that kind of led up to this. The 4 minutes of silence didn't come out of nowhere. Before that, famous composers like Schoenberg had made a new style of music by which there was no home. There's no tonality. So every note had to be equally represented. So it's called atonal music. And it's very distressing because it doesn't come to rest anywhere. There's no home. It's like portraying homelessness, ultimately a kind of meaninglessness. And in architecture, a similar thing was done by eliminating ornament. Because ornament ultimately represents the human figure, like we saw here. Right? So the column represents the human figure. So by eliminating things like the Greek orders, get rid of columns, entablatures, etc., what happens? It's eliminating the human. And so you get these skyscrapers in which you've got the anonymous cityscape. So the rejection of ornament serves the same purpose of ultimately taking away the human. And there was a whole ideology of this. At the beginning of the 20th century, there's numerous manifestos. Each artistic movement would make a manifesto in which they would proclaim their goals. One of these, Adolf Loos was a famous modernist architect, and he says, "I have made the following discovery and I pass it on to the world. The evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament. I believe that with this discovery I was bringing joy to the world. It hasn't thanked me. People were sad and hung their heads." Although, he's writing a long time ago. People have accepted it. Then I said, "Weep not. See, here lies the greatness of our age. It's incapable of producing a new ornament. We've outgrown ornament. We have fought our way through to freedom from ornament. See, the time is nigh. Fulfillment awaits us. Soon the streets of the city will glisten like white walls, like Zion, the holy city. Then fulfillment will come." Right? So it was a kind of messianic movement of getting rid of the human. And the result is our modern cities. A terrible experience. We used to live in Rome, and obviously, there's this unbelievable architecture, but we lived outside, and it's all modern apartment buildings that are so ugly. And you find that in all the European cities. Another manifesto, the Futurist Manifesto. "I oppose and despise all classical, solemn, hieratic, theatrical, decorative, monumental, frivolous, pleasing architecture." And it's not supposed to please. Right? It's an ideal of, ultimately, it's an anti-humanist art. Do the next one, Chris. Le Corbusier is one of the most famous architects of the 20th century. And he likewise says, a great epoch has begun, a new spirit. Architecture is stifled by custom. The styles are loud. We must create the mass production spirit, the spirit of constructing mass production houses, the spirit of living in mass production houses. Right? It seems to me that what we need is exactly the opposite. Right? Because the whole tendency of modern culture is taking away the human, but we're all human. Right? And we want an architecture that expresses, say, the ideal of humanity, individuality, harmony, etc. The culmination of this in architecture was the glass house. I don't know, do I have a picture of that? No. Again, you have to just imagine. Philip Johnson, it's like the 4 minutes, 33 seconds of silence. Philip Johnson, one of the famous architects of the 20th century, the culmination of his architecture was a glass house that practically you can't see, right? Except for the bathroom has to have walls. But I guess if he had his way, there wouldn't even be a bathroom.
What about Gary? Then does the buildings have slant?
Right. The same. It's because architecture is about a work of architecture shows order. Right? In architecture, you want the order of society, a foundation. Right? And so, if you make architecture that's falling over, it's playful. It can be fun, but you wouldn't want to live in it. And so, another aspect of modern art was not only did they eliminate ornament, but even the ideal of beauty. And so much of modern art was about dismemberment and being inspired by, say, African tribal masks and ultimately demonic images. In other words, those African tribal images were representing a certain kind of fear of that came out of false religious ideas. And so it comes back into 20th century art. Right, Picasso, de Kooning. Abstract art. And the same thing happens in the superrealism that we've looked at before. The next one. Right, we saw Chuck Close's big self-portrait. And even though here he's doing realism, it has the same intent, to ultimately to dehumanize, right? To take away to show the banality of life rather than the dignity of the human person. It's like we could say an anti-philosophical art, right? Whereas Aristotle said that art and poetry should be like philosophy and not just like the accidents of history. Superrealism in art tends to intentionally show the banality and the accidental quality. So a famous sculptor, George Siegel, he makes these body casts. And they're actually, he wraps figures with, what is that, you make bandages, like you're making a cast. So he makes these body casts and puts them on benches. And another aspect of modern art is pop art. And so in pop art, the idea was it was a criticism of a consumer society and taking those consumer items and blowing them up. So blowing up the Campbell's soup can, blowing up the Pepsi, or Mao Zedong, Andy Warhol. And so implicit in all of this is the idea that art has to represent the spirit of the times. The spirit of the times are bad. There's a loss of meaning coming out of a post-Christian society, and art simply represents that loss. Now, I don't think that's what the artist ought to do. But even simply doing that, it can serve a purpose, right? Because it can wake us up to what our society is lacking. Right? So, but nevertheless, art shouldn't just do that. Art has to show a positive, right? A positive ideal. St. Paul says in Romans 12:2, "Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed according to the renewing of your mind." And so the artist ought to help us to do that. And so, just in conclusion, art has a great mission in human culture. And it's precisely to make truth and goodness attractive. And it's especially important, I think, in education, in educating the young, but all of us ultimately. So it's to make goodness attractive, to manifest human dignity, to manifest the beauty of the moral good, and above all, the truth about the divine love. Benedict and our last popes have all said beautiful things about art. Pope Benedict recently, in 2009, quoting Paul VI, he said, "Your art consists," it's an address to artists, "your art consists in grasping treasures from the heavenly realm of the Spirit and clothing them in words, colors, and forms, making them accessible." Right? Making sensible spiritual things. Speaking about the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo's Last Judgment, he said, "The dramatic beauty of Michelangelo's painting, its colors and forms, becomes a proclamation of hope, an invitation to raise our eyes to the ultimate horizon." This bond between beauty and hope was the content of a message that Paul VI addressed to artists at the end of the Second Vatican Council. "To all of you," he said solemnly, "the Church of the Council declares through our lips, if you are friends of true art, you are our friends. This world in which we live needs beauty in order not to sink into despair. Beauty, like truth, brings joy to the human heart and is that precious fruit which resists the erosion of time, which unites generations and enables them to be one in admiration. And all this through the work of your hands. Remember, you are the custodians of beauty in the world." Right? What a beautiful way of speaking about the mission of the artist. And then he quotes a line from Dostoevsky, the great Russian author. "Man can live without science. He can live without bread." Right? The cavemen, they lived without science. "He can live without bread for a certain time, but without beauty, he could no longer live, because there would be no longer anything to do to the world. The whole secret is here. The whole of history is here." Right? But that will only be true if art is founded on faith. Thank you.